Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here talking with you. And I will be talking about a paper that I wrote not so long ago with Alberto Lesina, my close friends who passed away sadly a few months ago, and Francesco Trebbi. As Arian said, feel free to interrupt me with questions or comments as I go along. So the question that we ask in this paper is whether European political integration is feasible or not, and in particular, what are the obstacles that may prevent further integration in Europe. If you look at these pictures, you're immediately going to say, well, it's integration is hopeless. On the left, you see how Greece was seen in Germany. On the right, you see how Germany was seen in Greece during the sovereign debt crisis of 2010, 2011. The message that will come out of the analysis that we wrote is actually less pessimistic than this. And these stereotypes are funny, but they don't capture so well the political reality. And the bottom line of this paper is really that in the end, European countries are not so different and so incompatible as these pictures suggest. So the organizing framework from which we start was suggested by important work that Alberto Lesina and Enrico Spolaore did many years ago, where they asked what is the optimal area over which you should expect political integration. What is the optimal number of countries, and what drives the decision of regions or countries to integrate or to disintegrate? And the answer that they suggested to this question is that the optimal political area optimizes the trade-off between, on the one hand, exploiting economies of scale and scope in the provision of public goods that typically requires a very large area, because in areas like defense or infrastructures, the bigger you are, the more you can exploit economies of scale and scope, versus heterogeneity in the preferences of citizens, because a larger area will tend to have more heterogeneity in preferences, and heterogeneous preferences will then make it more difficult to integrate, either because collective decisions will be more difficult, or because some people will be left in the minority and will resent being part of this large area. And so, depending on the size of the economies of scale or the extent of heterogeneity of preferences, you define how large a political area should be with regard to these criteria. Now, if you think about how to apply this trade-off to Europe, it seems clear, not just to academics like myself, but to many citizens, that the economies of scale and scope in the provision of public goods are very strong. The world is becoming smaller. You have to cope with the giants like the US, China, or very large enterprises. And so all of this pushes towards thinking that there would be strong benefits from providing global public goods in an integrated Europe. And these are the opinions that were given by European citizens in surveys conducted after the financial crisis around 2016 on these issues of fighting terrorism, promoting peace and democracy, which essentially means defense and foreign policy, environmental policy, immigration policy, and energy policy. And in all of these areas, you see that the vast majority of the respondents were in favor of more decision-making at the level of the EU. And so with regard to this trade-off, the question that we ask in this paper is what are the stumbling blocks that prevents exploiting these economies of scale in the provision of these global public goods? And in particular, how heterogeneous are European citizens in different countries? Are we just too different from each other in order to integrate, or instead, are we sufficiently similar that we could exploit the benefits of economies of scale and integrate more forcefully, not in all dimensions, of course, but in some of these key dimensions that would, however, require forms of political integration. And then we also ask whether over time this trade-off has become more or less favorable, again, focusing on the heterogeneity of these countries in terms of their preferences to understand whether the enactment of the single currency and of the single market has actually made us more similar or more dissimilar, facilitating this trade-off towards integration. So in particular, the talk is organized, and the paper is organized around these three questions. First, we ask how different are Europeans in their fundamental cultural traits compared to the differences that we observe within countries in Europe or between US states. Then we ask whether there has been divergence or convergence in these fundamental cultural traits, because the functioning of institutions is another important dimension over which countries differ in relevant way. We ask whether over the recent periods there has been convergence or divergence in the functioning of institutions, and then we close with a general discussion. So the sample of countries that we consider is the EU 15 plus Norway. I don't know why Norway was there. We started with the sample and then we did not change it. But the important thing is that this does not include Central and Eastern Europe. And also the period that we consider is the period between 1980 and 2008 for data availability at the time. And so this was before the financial crisis and when populism was still not as forceful as it has become since then. And so what we do is to start by trying to understand how different Europeans are with regard to their fundamental cultural traits. So we consider 20 questions on fundamental issues in these 5 dimensions. One dimension is religiosity, which doesn't mean what religion you have, but how religious you are, namely how important is religion for you, and also what is your opinion on issues on which religion speaks, like euthanasia or suicide. We have a number of questions on gender equality, so the role of women in society and in the household, on sexual morality, so abortion, homosexuality, and divorce. A number of questions on the economic role of the state, in particular views on what is the role of government redistribution versus individual responsibility, what is the role of government in protecting property rights, and what is your general political ideology in an economic left to right dimension. And then we finally asked and use a number of questions on individual values and civic capital, like generalized trust, and what are the features that individuals appreciate in children, like obedience or hard work or unselfishness or ability to determine your path in life. The source for all these responses are the European value surveys. These are surveys that are periodically asked with the same format to representative samples of a large number of countries. We selected these questions for two reasons. One is that they capture important aspects of fundamental attitudes of the individuals towards others, towards society, and towards the state. We view political integration a little bit like a marriage, an incomplete contract. You don't specify all features of this contract. There are many things that are left unspecified. And what is important when you choose a partner, whether for politics or for life, is whether you share a common fundamental view of the world. You don't care so much whether your tastes for ice cream or wine are similar, but whether you really share fundamental visions. And these questions, of course, relate to these fundamental aspects. Second reason was that many of these questions have been shown to be fairly stable in the analysis of cultural traits, and they also tend to be correlated with the functioning of institutions and with the functioning of the economy. Not all of them, but some of them do, or with individual decisions like labor supply, female labor supply. And finally, a third reason for focusing on these questions and not others is that they were available systematically for all the countries in our sample and for all the waves, and so all the years that we study in this paper. The sample consists of, therefore, a large number of individuals. In the paper, we have 250 individuals in each country, times 16 countries, times 4 waves between 1980 and 2008. And in fact, the results are almost identical if you enlarge to 500 individuals per country. We did not use all individuals. The survey contains 1,500 respondents in each country, because as you will see, we manipulate the data in a particular way. And if the data set is too large, it was just too cumbersome to be used, and it would require too much computer memory. So think of an observation in this sample as, I'll use a technical word and then I'll explain it more precisely, more intuitively, as a vector of cultural traits of one individual. So there are all these individuals, 250 times 16 times 4, or 500 times 16 times 4, and each individual provides answers to 20 questions. Okay, so we have a space of 20 dimensions, one dimension for each of these 20 questions. And in this space of 20 dimensions, each observation is given by the answers provided by each of these individuals. And what we want to understand is how different are these individuals from each other. In particular, how different are individuals who belong to the same country or to different countries. And so what we do is to measure the distance between the points, these individuals, in this 20-dimensional space. So for those of you who know a little bit of mathematics, we measure the cultural distance as the Gaussian kernel between these vectors of cultural traits. But if this was a one dimension only, you think of this just as a Euclidean distance between these points. In this larger space, it's a bigger distance. And so the object that we have, Dij, is the distance between one individual and another in this space of answers. And throughout the analysis, I'm going to display data on the distance in what I will call unconditional and conditional culture. By unconditional, I mean just the distance between these points. So the distance in the answers that you provide to these questions. When I talk about conditional, I mean how different these two individuals are once you take into account their socio-demographic features, their age, their education, their gender, whether they live in an urban or a rural area, and so on. And so in particular, by conditional culture, conditional distance in conditional culture, I mean precisely the distance in the estimated residuals of a regression, where the dependent variable is the answer that I have given to this question, and then I take into account your age, your education, your level of income, and so on. And I look at the distance in the answers after I have taken into account these individual features. Okay, so before I show you the results, let me pause and ask you if you have questions or comments so far. Okay, if not, then let me show you the first result. So this picture, and you will see a number of these, displays the distribution of distances between two individuals in our sample. The distance has been, the answers have been normalized, and the distance have been normalized so that it lies between 0 and 1. Okay, so the maximum distance is 1. On the left, you see the unconditional cultural distance. So the distance between these two individuals, just looking at how they answer. And on the right, it's the distance in conditional cultural traits. The dotted line is the distribution of bilateral distances between two individuals that belong to the same country. The solid line is the distribution of distances between two individuals who belong to two different countries in the sample. This, I should add, only refers to the most recent wave, 2008. So we are taking a snapshot in 2008. So you see that there are very few individuals who are almost identical, provide the same answers to these 20 questions. There are very few individuals who are very, very different, provide this maximum distance of 1. On average, the average distance is about 0.6. But what is striking, and we were very surprised when we saw this picture to begin with, is that the distribution of distances between individuals belonging to different countries are very similar to the distribution of distances of individuals belonging to the same country. The mean of the solid line, solid distribution, is only 5 percentage points higher than the dotted distribution. So on average, the average distance between individuals that belong to the same country, that belong to different countries, is only 5% larger than the average distance of individuals belonging to the same country. So this doesn't mean that French and German citizens are similar. It just means that there is a lot of heterogeneity within France and within Germany. So the additional heterogeneity that you have when you compare a French and a German is roughly the same as the heterogeneity that you have when you observe two Frenchmen or a French woman or two Germans. So again, I guess this is the key message of this paper. Yes, we are different, but we are not much more different than within countries, precisely with the sample of questions, only 5% more different on average, because there is huge heterogeneity within each of these countries. And so if you think about the trade-off that I started with, if France and Germany can function well as politically integrated areas, heterogeneity of preferences in these fundamental cultural traits should not be a key reason why a politically integrated Europe should also not function well. This doesn't mean that we should integrate tomorrow. It means that if we are thinking about what prevents a successful political integration, it's hard to say that it has to do with heterogeneity of these fundamental cultural traits. Are there questions or comments?
Hi, Professor. I think we have one in the chat. I'm sorry. If Thomas wants to read it out, I'll let him read it out.
Oh, sure. Thank you. No, I wanted to ask, let me get my question. Yeah, what I wanted to ask was, will the increase in globalization over time also decrease the homogeneity of European cultures?
So let me postpone the answer to this question. I'll come to it in some of the in a few minutes.
Thank you.
So I'll come to that. Other questions or comments? Okay, so before I turn to the question that Thomas asked, let me say a few things. First, one reaction that you may have to this is that maybe this is not very meaningful because there is too much measurement error. So maybe the heterogeneity within countries that is suggested by these graphs just masks a huge measurement error. And we think that that is not the case. And there are different ways to convince you of that, but maybe one way is to repeat the same exercise for Europe and Turkey. So here we look at the same 20 questions asked in Turkey, and we computed the difference with the distribution of distances within Turkey and between Turkey and any other European country, or between Turkey and France, unconditional and conditional. And now you see instead much bigger shifts in the distribution when you compare distances between Turkey and France, between Turkey and Europe. So when you take countries that a priori you would expect to be more different in these fundamental traits, this methodology uncovers important differences between countries. So it's unlikely to be just the measurement error. I think we are measuring something meaningful. Here, let me skip this for the sake of time. We ask a different question instead. We can compute with this methodology where the cultural center of Europe lies. So think of the cultural center of Europe as the average cultural trait in Europe. So if this was a one-dimensional, so if it was only one question, say how left or right are you, the center would just be the average in Europe of this answer. Here we have 20 answers for each individual. So we have to define the cultural center in a slightly more different way. We define it as the centroid, which is defined by this formula. But for all practical purposes, think of this as the center of this distribution of points in the space of 20 answers. Now, so we first compute where the cultural center of Europe lies, the average. And then for each individual, we can compute how distant this individual is in his cultural attitudes from the cultural average of Europe. And because we know the region of residence of each respondent, we can compute the average distance of each region from the cultural center of Europe. Okay, and this is what the data say. This shaped no data means that we have no data. This is for Switzerland and a few other regions. Otherwise, the way to read this picture is that lighter color refer to smaller distances between the residents of that region and the European average, while darker colors reflect larger distance between the resident of that region and the average of Europe. And you see here that the center of Europe is about here, the cultural center of Europe is Germany. So Germany is the cultural core of Europe in the sense that it is most similar to the average cultural traits of Europeans. Notice that we are not weighting the average by the size of the nation. If we weighted, then of course Germany would be even closer because there are more Germans than Portuguese. But even in an unweighted way, you see that the cultural core of Europe is Germany. This is important because Germany is also the economic core of Europe. And so if the cultural core and the economic core coincide and the cultural periphery and the economic periphery coincide, then maybe this spells trouble because there is more, because there is a correlation between your cultural heterogeneity and economic disagreement between rich and poor countries. But in fact, if you look at the economic periphery, like Portugal, some of the Italian Mezzogiorno, Greece, they are different, more distance from the average than Germany, but they certainly are not the cultural periphery. The cultural periphery, somewhat surprising, tends to be more France, some regions of Sweden, some regions of the UK, some regions of Italy. But we cannot say that the economic periphery, namely the less integrated or less rich regions in Europe, are also those who are more distant from the European average in terms of cultural trait. And the third message that this map displays is again how much heterogeneity there is within countries. So you see a lot of heterogeneity within Italy, within France, and France actually seems to be the area that is more special in its cultural traits compared to the rest of Europe. We also asked whether this cultural distance matters for integration. So we asked whether individual attitudes towards integration in a number of areas are correlated with how distant the respondent is from the European average. So fear of the EU, our dependent variable, is the average of 4 or 5 questions on how fearful is the respondent to integrate further in different areas of European policy making. And as you see, respondents are more opposed to European integration if they are more distant culturally from the European average. And this is true when you control for individual features of the respondent, for where he lives, for the region where he resides. So this suggests that cultural heterogeneity is important, but, and this reinforces the previous message that cultural heterogeneity is not preventing European integration. The size of this coefficient is small, meaning that individuals who are more distant in their cultural traits from the average are more fearful of European integration, but to a small extent. So if you were to reduce cultural distance from its average distance to the minimum distance, you would reduce the fear of European integration by only 6 percentage points. So this says that these coefficients are quantitatively not important in determining your attitudes towards European integration.
Just very quickly, Professor Guido, just a quick reminder that we have about 5-10 minutes left before we'd like to start some Q&A, and so we can get some more interaction going. Just a quick heads up.
Okay, very good. So then we asked the same questions about on the US. So we repeated the same exercise for US states, and we find again that there is a lot of heterogeneity within US states, not much between, and the degree of heterogeneity is very similar in the US and Europe. So here you have the distribution of cultural distance between residents of different states in the US and residents of the same state. There are 2 distributions that actually overlap, and so the distribution here is the same. And here instead, we compare the distribution of distances in the US for respondents who belong to the same state and in Europe. And you see that there is more within state heterogeneity in the US than there is within country heterogeneity in Europe, but not much. And if you compare between country heterogeneity in Europe, the dotted line, and between states heterogeneity in the US, they are very similar. So US states are not culturally more similar to each other compared to European countries. So here too, the answer to the question is it's about the same degree of heterogeneity that we observe in a well-functioning federation like the US. Last or next, the question that Thomas asked, did this change over time? And in particular, by integrating economically, have we become more similar or dissimilar to each other? And we know that we have integrated economically with a single market, with the single currency. So all of this suggests that maybe we have become more similar. On the other hand, when you trade, globalization induces countries to specialize in different sectors and different industries. And so this may make you more different, not necessarily more similar. And so a priori, we don't know whether economic integration and globalization led to convergence or divergence. One can tell stories going either way by integrating economically, we transact more frequently, we see each other more frequently. This makes us more similar. On the other hand, integration, economic integration, makes us specialize, and this can make us more different. Well, here is the answer. So here, the dotted line is the distribution of bilateral distances in 1980, the first wave. The solid line is the distribution of bilateral distances in the last wave of 2008. So here we depict the distribution of distances between individuals belonging to different countries. Here we depict the distribution of distances of individuals belonging to the same country. And as you see, there has been divergence. So we have become more different between countries in 2008 than we were in 1980, despite the economic integration, or maybe because of the economic integration. However, the same happened within countries. So this suggests that it is not economic integration per se that has made us more different, but rather something else, maybe the internet, maybe, as was suggested, globalization as such, also within countries. And in fact, if you repeat the same exercise in the US, we see the same. So in the US too, the distribution of bilateral distances in 2008 has become shifted to the right, so more distant on average, compared to the distribution of distances in the 1980s. So the fact that there has been divergence is probably a global phenomenon. It's not large. We're talking about 5-10 percentage point increase in average distance. But the fact that it has occurred within countries and in the US suggests that it's probably not due to economic integration per se. How much time do I have left?
A couple of minutes more. So if you want to take a little bit more time, that's fine as well.
Okay, so what we do in the last part of the paper is to discuss whether there has been convergence or divergence in the functioning of institutions. We measure these 4 aspects of the functioning of institutions: quality of survey-based measure of the quality of government, survey-based and hard measures of the functioning of legal institutions, the regulatory environment, and also PISA scores, namely educational outcomes. And we ask, have European countries become more similar or more dissimilar? We look at the cross-country variability, what economists have called sigma convergence, so indicators of cross-country variability. And this is the answer. We have become more similar in the educational outcomes, essentially because the South has improved and the North has deteriorated. We have become more similar in the regulation of product markets. This was not surprising. The Lisbon process was about benchmarking and harmonizing regulation. However, we have become more dissimilar in the quality of the legal institution and the functioning of government, at least since the year 2000. So overall, these are the answers to the questions that we posed. We are not very different compared both to the US and to within countries. We have become a little bit more different, but also within countries as also in the US. And we have become also somewhat more different in some institutions and more similar in other institutions. And so if the starting question was what prevents political integration in Europe, the answer that these data suggest is that it is not the heterogeneity in these deeply held cultural traits, which is the stumbling block. Instead, we think that it is the sense of strong national identities. The fact that we Italians think of ourselves as being sharing a common identity, which somehow makes us different from people in Germany. And these strong national identities, of course, were very good because they facilitated national integration, they facilitate compromise and cooperation within countries, but they create stereotypes, they exaggerate national differences, and they create a perception of excessive differences between countries relative to the reality. And so if we are to have a successful political integration, we should not be so worried about the fact that Germans and Italians are different. They are, but Italians are very different within Italy and Germans are very different within Germany. We need to find a shared identity, a shared common European identity. And this can be achieved through the educational system. The functioning of public education has been a key tool to create a common national identity. And also, we discuss in the paper other methods that have to do with how you make collective decisions within Europe. So let me stop here, and I'll be glad to talk more about these issues if you have questions or comments.
Thank you very, very much for the